Welcome to The Explainer. We're about to get into a story where a courtroom verdict, well, it wasn't even close to the final word. It's a case from over a century ago, but its impact is still felt today. It's about how a single murder spiraled into a national controversy, pitting the justice system against mob rule and leaving a scar on America that never really healed.
So everything we're about to talk about happens over just 2 really intense years in Atlanta, Georgia. It all kicks off with a terrible tragedy, the murder of a young factory girl. But that one event, it just sets off this chain reaction, this firestorm. It leads to a trial that's basically fueled by pure public rage, and then a brutal act of so-called justice that would change the country forever.
Okay, let's set the scene. We're going back to April 26, 1913. The city is Atlanta, and it's really trying to sell itself as this hub of the New South, all modern, all industrial. But that's just the surface. Underneath, you've got these old tensions just simmering, ready to boil over. You've got the working poor versus the factory owners. You've got longtime Southerners versus these new industrialists coming down from the north. It's a powder keg, really.
And at the center of this storm is a 13-year-old girl, Mary Phagan. She's one of countless kids working in these factories. And on this particular day, she just went in to pick up her pay, $1.20. That's it. And the last person to admit seeing her alive, well, that was the factory's superintendent, a guy named Leo Frank. He was 29, educated at Cornell, a Northerner, a total outsider in this world.
Now this is where it gets strange. Near her body, police find these 2 cryptic, really poorly written notes. And one of them mentions a night witch, which the police immediately took to mean the night watchman, a black man named Newt Lee. So at first, all eyes are on him. But, with the public absolutely screaming for answers, the investigation, it starts to pivot. And that focus shifts right from Newt Lee to Leo Frank. And what's just wild is how fast this whole thing moved. Just 3 months after the murder, Leo Frank is on trial for his life. But here's the thing, you could make a very strong case that the real trial wasn't even happening inside the courtroom. No, it was playing out in the headlines of the newspapers and on the streets of Atlanta, where it felt like the entire city was demanding one thing: a guilty verdict.
The entire trial, and I mean all of it, really boiled down to one man's word against another's. On the prosecution side, you have their star witness, Jim Conley, the factory janitor. Now, this is a guy who had changed his story over and over again, but he finally lands on this version where he helped Frank get rid of the body. The defense, on the other hand, they're pointing the finger right back at Conley. They're saying, no, he's the murderer, and he's just making all of this up to save his own skin.
And the atmosphere around this trial, it was just toxic. You had newspapers whipping up this frenzy, crowds literally chanting outside the courthouse. The prosecutor, who was desperate for a big political win, started painting Frank as some kind of sexual deviant. And then came this absolutely jaw-dropping argument from the prosecution. They actually argued to the all-white jury that Jim Conley, as a black man, just wasn't smart enough to have made up such a complicated lie. And that argument worked. Think about this. The pressure got so intense that the judge himself was afraid there'd be a riot. He actually told Frank and his lawyers not to even be in the room when the verdict was read, for their own safety. And the verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty. The sentence, death by hanging.
But this story was far from over. Frank's legal team, they didn't give up. They fought that verdict tooth and nail, appeal after appeal, taking it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But every single one failed. And so, with all legal roads closed, his fate, his life, ended up in the hands of just one man, the governor of Georgia.
So let me tell you about Governor John Slayton. He was literally days away from leaving office. The easy thing, the politically safe thing to do, just let the execution happen. But he didn't. Instead, even though he was getting death threats, he decided to launch his own review. We're talking 10,000 pages of court records and evidence. And what he started to uncover, it just floored him.
He started to see these massive holes in the prosecution's story. Remember Jim Conley's claim about using the elevator to move the body? Well, Slayton found evidence in the elevator shaft that showed it hadn't been disturbed. It just couldn't have happened that way. And those murder notes? Turns out they were written on order pads that were only kept in the basement where Conley worked, not in Frank's office. And maybe the biggest red flag of all? The murder was supposed to have happened on the 2nd floor, but there was absolutely no blood found there. The whole official story? It was just collapsing.
And then, Slatton finds what might be the final nail in the coffin for the prosecution's case. The trial judge himself, a man named Leonard Ryan, had written in private that even he wasn't convinced Frank was guilty. So, facing this mountain of doubt, the governor knew what he had to do. He commuted the sentence to life in prison. He famously said that he couldn't live with himself if he let Frank hang, that he would feel like a murderer, too.
You might think that's an act of incredible courage, right? Well, that is not how a lot of people in Georgia saw it. To them, it was a betrayal. The public, whipped into a frenzy by a populist publisher named Tom Watson, was absolutely furious. The story they told themselves was that a guilty man had used his money and his connections up north to escape justice.
And what followed? This was not some spontaneous burst of anger. No, this was a cold, calculated, meticulously planned murder. A group of the most powerful and prominent men in the area, they called themselves the Vigilance Committee, they planned the whole thing. They drove 175 miles, cut the prison's phone lines, broke in, kidnapped Leo Frank from a state penitentiary, and then drove him all the way back to Marietta, which just happened to be Mary Phagan's hometown. And there, they hanged him from an oak tree. And these men, they didn't even try to hide what they'd done. They actually posed for pictures with Frank's body. Photos that were later turned into postcards and sold as souvenirs. And the number of people who were ever charged with the kidnapping and murder of Leo Frank? 0. Not a single one. But even the lynching wasn't the end of this story. Not even close. In fact, the aftermath sent these huge shockwaves across the country, creating these two powerful and completely opposite legacies that, honestly, we are still dealing with today. So on one side, you have the intense, ugly anti-Semitism that was just bubbling up all through the trial and then exploded with the lynching. This absolutely galvanized the American Jewish community. And in direct response to this case, the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, was created with a clear mission to fight anti-Semitism and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. But at the very same time, that exact same hatred that was stirred up by the Frank case, it fueled something much, much darker. Just a few months after the lynching, a group climbs to the top of Stone Mountain, not far from Atlanta. They light a massive cross, and they announce the revival, the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. They literally use the public rage from the Frank case as fuel to launch a new, terrifying era of the Klan. For decades after, the case just sat there like this open, painful wound. And then, in 1982, a bombshell drops. A man named Alonzo Mon, who was just a 14-year-old office boy back in 1913, makes a deathbed confession. He signs a statement saying that on the day of the murder, he saw Jim Conley alone carrying Mary Phagan's body. He said Conley threatened to kill him if he ever told anyone, and this pushed the state of Georgia to finally take another look. So finally, in 1986, the state of Georgia issues a pardon. But, and this is so important, it wasn't a pardon of innocence. It was something else entirely. It was, you could say, a pardon born of shame. The state was officially admitting that it had failed. It failed to protect Leo Frank in its own prison, and it failed to bring his killers to justice. It was this stunning admission that the entire system had completely broken down. And it leaves us with a question that, frankly, still haunts us today. When fear and hatred grip a community, is the idea of innocent until proven guilty the very first casualty?